I'm Rochelle James Gregory, Marketing Director for Carver State Bank. Thank you for joining us for this conversation on Black-owned banks, past, present, and future. The murder of George Floyd and the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement sparked a renewed interest in the importance of supporting our own institutions within the Black community. This is also the case for Black-owned financial institutions, which are arguably one of the most important links to closing the wealth gap in America. I personally have heard many stories of Black people here in Savannah who were unable to get a loan for their home, car, or business from a majority bank. Some are older stories from people who were telling me stories from the 1960s and 70s, but others are much more current. So I'm excited that we are having this conversation this evening. And we are so fortunate that right here in Savannah, we are home to one of the few remaining Black-owned banks in the country, Carver State Bank, and a renowned historian who has evolved as an expert on the subject matter. As marketing director for Carver State, we're proud to partner with the Black Heritage Festival for this event. With that, I'd like to introduce Vonette Goodwalker, who will moderate this evening's conversation. Vonette is currently the director at the Ralph Mark Gilbert Civil Rights Museum. In 2014, she conducted the research necessary to reinterpret and create the exhibit for the King Tisdale Cottage, a Black History House museum here in Savannah. Goodwalker is the former director of cultural diversity of the Telfair Museums, where she also worked as assistant curator of education at the Telfair's Owens Thomas House to introduce the social history of its former inhabitants, white and Black, men, women, and children, free and enslaved. She's worked for over 2 decades as a broadcast journalist, both on air and as a network news writer for ABC Radio TV and CNN domestic and international networks. In 2009, she established the Footprints of Savannah Walking Tour Company to educate visitors and local residents about the rich and diverse history of Savannah. Second, I'd like to introduce Nicole Elam. Nicole is president and CEO of the National Bankers Association, or NBA, the premier trade association and voice for the nation's minority financial institutions. She is the youngest president and CEO since the NBA's founding in 1927. She joined the NBA in May 2021 from JP Morgan Chase, where she was vice president and government relations manager developing public policy positions and advocacy strategies in Washington, D.C. She spent more than 17 years working in public policy and public affairs. Prior to JP Morgan Chase, she led the government and external affairs strategy for ITT Education Services Incorporated and served as its primary spokesperson and lead representative with the media, policymakers, trade organizations, consumer groups, investors, and the public. She's also worked as senior director at the government affairs firm ICE Miller Strategies. She's held legal roles as an attorney, focusing on congressional investigations and government enforcement actions, and as a law clerk at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund in Washington. She received her Juris Doctorate degree from the Howard University School of Law and a Bachelor of Arts degree from DePaul University. Secondly, I'm going to introduce Robert James II, also known as my big brother. Rob leverages his experience in banking, law, real estate development, and consulting to provide the building blocks to financial freedom at Carver Financial, the holding company of Carver State Bank in Savannah. Under his leadership, Carver has doubled its capital in the past year and won $80 million in new markets tax credits from the U.S. Treasury since 2017, the first ever in Georgia for a community bank or entity outside Atlanta, and created hundreds of jobs in distressed communities across the state. He's also led the first ever all-Black bank syndicate to finance a project for a major American sports franchise, the 2021 refinancing of the Atlanta Hawks practice facility. He is chairman of the National Bankers Association. He's also a member of the boards of the Community Development Bankers Association, National Black Bank Foundation, the National Bankers Community Alliance, and serves as executive director of Carver's nonprofit CDFI affiliate, Catalyst Development Corporation. He graduated from Harvard Law School in '95 and from Howard University in 1992. And finally, the elder statesman of the group, also known as Dad, Robert E. James. Robert James is chairman of the board and president of Carver State Bank. He's also chairman of Carver Financial Corporation, the holding company that owns the bank. Having served as president of Carver since 1971, more than 50 years, he holds the distinction of being one of Georgia's longest tenured bank presidents and the African American with the longest tenure of service as president of a bank in America. A native of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, he received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Morris Brown College and the Master in Business Administration degree from Harvard University. In 1973, he revived the Savannah Tribune weekly newspaper, one of the oldest newspapers owned by African Americans in the nation. During 1978, he served as chairman of the National Bankers Association. He was elected to a second term as chairman in 1990. He served on the board of the Georgia Telecommunications Authority, chairman of the Foundation for Public Broadcasting in Georgia, and a member of the National Board of the Public Broadcasting Service. He's past chairman of Step Up Savannah Incorporated, the Savannah Economic Development Authority, and is the immediate past chairman of the Board of Trustees for St. Joseph Candler Health System. He's a former board member of the Savannah Area Chamber of Commerce and United Way of the Coastal Empire. Dad's a trustee of St. Philip African Methodist Episcopal Church, a life member of the NAACP and a Black Men of Savannah Incorporated, Sigma Pi Phi Fraternity, and the Frogs Club. He's earned many citations for his civic and professional accomplishments. I won't name them all, but they've included the 5 Outstanding Young Men in Georgia by the Georgia JCs, one of the 100 Most Influential Black Americans by Ebony Magazine. He's been recorded in the Library of Congress as part of the History Makers archival collection since 2007. 21 Senior Citizens Incorporated of Savannah presented him with one of its Legends, Leaders, and Life Well Lived awards. He was also inducted and is very proud to have been inducted into the Hattiesburg, Mississippi Hall of Fame by the Hattiesburg Public School Foundation and Savannah Business Hall of Fame by Junior Achievement of Georgia in 2021. He has 3 children, 2 of which are on this call, and 6 grandchildren.
Well, good evening and thank you. I'm really excited to be a part of the 31st annual Savannah Black Heritage Festival and to continue the work started many years ago by my hero, Wesley Wallace Law. This is the WW Law Lecture tonight, and we are proud to talk about the continuation of something that our young people don't hear much about these business. And Black-owned businesses are kind of, not around. And I sit here having grown up in Savannah. Carver State Bank was a part of that an institution. Where can we find our Black institutions today? And I'm proud to say, I'm so glad that it's here. I mean, I was there for the 90th anniversary. And so I was really curious a few years ago about who was the founder. The vault you see behind me is what I get to see every day at the Ralph Martin Gilbert Civil Rights Museum, which was founded as a bank in 1914. And that bank survived until, of course, the Great Depression. But the Carver Savings Bank was private until 1947. For the story of the ancestor that I've come to learn more about than I ever thought I could, and that's Lewis Burke Toomer. Lewis Burke Toomer was born in 1897 here in Savannah. His early beginnings, sort of fuzzy, like a lot of the history that we don't write about ourselves, but that others write for us. But Toomer was the son of Edward and Hannah Toomer, and his well. And interestingly enough, and Mr. James can appreciate this, his grandfather was a member of St. Philip AME on West Broad. So there's an interesting connection to begin with. His grandfather also was a part of the Colored Tribune, which becomes the Savannah Tribune, another connection to, whether you planned it or not, you couldn't have made a better story than becoming the owner and publisher of the Savannah Tribune and continuing to also have another Black-owned business continue its history here in Savannah. Now, Mr. Toomer, he was a businessman. He lived and worked in the heart of Savannah's historically Black business community, contributed to that community in 1927 when he opened the Georgia Savings and Realty Corporation. So I think I love the line that I read about him. You know, I rent the land and sell I think that it's some kind of combination of those two, but he was quite a businessman. And in my own personal experience, many years later, from first grade through eighth grade, his daughter, Lavon Toomer, was my classmate. And I never knew this history until I started to, figure all this out. At any rate, his success was noted in the Savannah Tribune and Mr. Toomer's success in 1937, when the Georgia Savings Bank was listed as the only Black bank in Savannah. It survived. All the other banks had shut down during the Great Depression, but it survived that. And the bank in 1947 goes public, and the name was changed to Carver Savings Bank. It would hold that name until 1961, when it was taken over by another gentleman who had a lot to do with our community, and that was Lawrence Perry. And he had been a cashier. And preparing for this conversation tonight, and maybe that can be the first question that I asked of the panelists. When you're a cashier in a bank, you're not like just a cashier. You're kind of you're running things. From what I began to read into the people who have been cashiers become like bank presidents. So that might be one of the things that you could help us understand how that works. And also, I have to mention, it's not political, but Mr. Toomer was a Republican. And having gone to the Republican convention in the 1950s, he becomes a registrar, the Treasury. I'm sure, do you have any dollars with his signature? I would love to see that in a museum, wink, wink. So I think that's, an interesting part of it. And of course, President Eisenhower brought him into the fold. But one of the things I have to mention, because as I did the research on Mr. Toomer, I realized that he was private until 1947. And interestingly enough, a little known fact that I dug up, I think, was that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, came to Savannah for their conference and would have gotten right off the train there on West Broad Street, right into his hands, as it were. And I'm sure he probably attended that. And of course, he goes public the next year. And, the rest is history that we will get to hear. I also have to say that Mr. Toomer is also honored in one of the squares, probably other than Henri Christophe and the Haitian Monument, the only person of color in a Savannah square. In Chatham Square, there is, it was there in 1964, Virginia Kaya put up this sundial there in his honor. And then a few years ago, he had another honor added to that in that square. And this is the George historical marker that tells his story. So sometimes stop by. By the way, on one side of this photo, you see the president of Carver State Bank. And on the other side, this Savannah Black Heritage Festival, Ms. Shirley James. And again, we thank her for the opportunity to get to keep continuing doing these great programs. So I would like to sort of ease into hearing the story of, as much as you can tell us, Mr. James, on how you have been able to guide the ship for 50 years and continue to be one of the leading Black banks in the nation still.
Thank you very much, Bonnet. While you were talking, I had a lot of interesting recollections of things that took place during my early years. I arrived in Savannah during the tenure of Lawrence D. Perry, and Mr. Perry had been the cashier under Louis B. Toomer, and it was a kind of a normal transition of leadership. And you mentioned that title, cashier. Historically, in a small bank, you would have a president, a vice president, and a cashier. They would be the top three officers. And the cashier was the person who knew most about the bank. He was the person who managed all of the operations and did all of the reconciliation of the general ledger and the books and the supervised bookkeepers and the posting. So that person had a thorough knowledge of the institution. And if that person had a executive leadership quality to them, very often that the cashier would emerge as the successor president, and that's what happened in the case of the transition from Mr. Toomer to Mr. Perry. But I came, and Carver is unique in that respect. We've only had 3 presidents in 95 years, and so I followed Mr. Perry. But my introduction to Carver State Bank came in a unique situation. I was during my 2 years at Harvard Business School, and the process to earn that degree required you to write it wasn't a dissertation or that kind of thing. It was a research report, and between the period between your first and second year of the MBA program, it was a routine that you all had to go and work for a business. So I happened to be in Baker Library on the Harvard Business School campus one day, and I saw the green and white signs of CNS Bank, and everybody who was from Georgia would have recognized one of those CNS Bank signs. It was a dominant bank in the state of Georgia and one of the dominant banks in the Southeast. And having gone to college in Atlanta, I recognized that sign. So I walked up to the people who were recruiters and just started talking to them in the hall of the library. And they were there to recruit people who were graduating second year, and I was a first year student. But in the course of that conversation, I talked them into a summer job. I reflected on the fact that I'd gone to college in Atlanta, and I knew all about CNS Bank, and it would be exciting for me to go back to Atlanta for the summer, and I needed to find a summer position. And so I was invited by a fellow by the name of Eugene Rackley, who was the head of system personnel at CNS Bank, and Archie Davis. Now, the Archie Davis name of those two people is a well-known name in the history of Savannah, well-known name in the history of North Carolina. His daddy was Archie Davis was the head of North Carolina National Bank, and he was the chairman of the American Bankers Association in his history. And so Archie and I became friends. I was invited to come to Atlanta to work that summer. But while I was working in Atlanta, I decided to do my research report on Mills B. Lane, the founder of CNS Bank and the president. And I decided to, in that course of that conversation with him, he said, well, you need to go to Savannah. That's where I'm doing all of my community development work. He had started this community development corporation, had done something, and some of you might remember he built some round houses, but he made a lot of loans to people who eventually became my friends, small business owners and in the Black community, Lipsy Motors and Bird Service Center, a lot of the Black contractors and so forth. And so I came down to Savannah, flew down to Savannah on the CNS jet, by the way, and came down to do some research on his community development corporation. So when I went into the building and was waiting on my appointment with a fellow by the name of Bill Van Landingham, who was the head of the community development corporation. He eventually went on to be chairman of the bank for a while, I believe. But Bill Van Landingham's administrative assistant, was Mrs. Betty Ellington, the wife of the legendary basketball coach, Russell Ellington, and who was also a graduate of Morris Brown College and was a football star at Morris Brown. So Betty and I became friends, and just sitting around chatting, she asked me if I knew that there was a Black-owned bank in Savannah. And I said, what? And she said, a Black-owned bank in Savannah. And she said, would you like for me to introduce you to the people? And so Mrs. Betty Ellington called Mr. Perry and arranged a meeting for me. And so while I was in Savannah to do my research, this would have been the summer of 1969, I went over and was introduced to the president of Carver State Bank, and got to know him, sat in his office, and I was so intrigued. So during that meeting, I told Mr. Perry, I said, Mr. Perry, you know, I've got one more year of graduate school, but if you offer me a job, I would take it. Life was simpler at that time. I didn't have the bills. so I told him, any amount of money you offer it, I'm sure I'll take it. So Mr. Perry, you know, I'm sure he was busy, and he really never followed up on that offer. But when I went back to school, I would go into Baker Library, and Baker Library was a tremendous resource. They would collect financial information on all businesses all across the country. So I could pick up a Savannah newspaper and could keep up with the bank. They collected the call reports, the legal reports of banks in that library. And so I kept up with the financial condition of the bank, even as I was completing my second year of graduate school. And then if you fast forward, after graduating, after completing that summer at CNS Bank, I was offered a position at the bank immediately. They told me, well, you know, if we're gonna hold a spot for you if you want to come back to CNS. And I interviewed with SunTrust Bank and First National at the time, or Trust Company, Bank of Georgia and First National, because I did like the idea of going back to Atlanta. And I was offered 3 positions in Atlanta, all 3 of the major banks. And of course, I was offered a position, 2 other positions that I seriously considered. One was to do a PhD at Michigan State, and work under a good friend of Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Robert Greene was there at the time. He was running a funded program, and I was offered the opportunity to be the finance director of that program. And so I visited Michigan State, but it was snowing when I went on that visit, and I was so tired of that snow in Boston. And so there was no way I was going to go from Boston over to Michigan to East Lansing and go from one snowy temperature to another one. And so that kind of ruled that out, even though I maintained a wonderful relationship with Dr. Greene for years. And then the other job was at First Chicago. A fellow by the name of Robert O'Boo was chairman of the board of First Chicago. He was one of the leading bankers in the country at that time. He was on front cover of Time magazine for a period. He was a trailblazer. And so he had offered me a position to come to First Chicago, but I turned all of that down and went back to Georgia. And so I started working at CNS Bank, and as fate would have it, and I kept up with Carver State Bank while I was in Atlanta at CNS, because we were the primary correspondent bank of Carver State Bank in Savannah. And so I could read the credit file, and I could keep up with what was going on at Carver State Bank, even from a distance. So Mr. Perry announced that he was retiring. And the board at Carver State Bank established a search committee to find his successor. I found out about it, and I applied for the job. A couple of legends in the history of Savannah were on that search committee. John B. Clemens was on that search committee. Mr. J.W. McLaughlin was on that search committee, and they were both board members of Carver State Bank. But I did get the interview, and was subsequently offered the job and accepted the job. I took a salary cut from my entry-level position at CNS to become president of Carver State Bank. I took a $500, I believe my salary at CNS Bank was $13,500, my very first salary, and my very first salary at Carver was $13,000. So I took a $500 salary cut to be president of Carver State Bank. So I moved to Savannah. At that time, CNS Bank and Mr. Lane owned what was called the DeSoto Hilton Hotel. I moved into a corner room on the 6th floor of the Hilton, and that was my house during the transition period. Now, and I was getting ready to move down here, and my wife was about to have my son, and so we were. I think, and I might have my times crossed, but when we moved here, he was an infant. I lived in that hotel until we actually found this house in Sylvan Terrace and made the purchase, and so we're still living in the house that we bought during that period. But my transition, my journey is a unique one. My decisions to stay at Carver State Bank for 50 years is somewhat attuned to my personality. The fact that, when in my household and my parents, you get a job, you keep your job, and whereas a lot of my Harvard Business School people, friends, if they were in business, they changed jobs, 4 or 5 times during the first 4 or 5 years. But I stayed at Carver State Bank and became a part of its history. So I'll pause there, but
well, you said some really good. That was some good information. Now you were bandying about the name CNS Bank. Yeah. Now, I understand that there was another CNS Bank in Philadelphia, founded by Richard R. Wright, correct?
I believe so. Richard R. Wright, I have an interesting history with him. One of the advantages of being around so long is that all of these legends in Black banks, I personally knew them, knew their relatives, I came across them. Richard R. Wright, who was instrumental in the establishment of the organization where Nicole was a president of Savannah State. And he was and I believe there is a monument in our church in St. Philip. You mentioned St. Philip AME Church, but I think his name is on one of those marble monuments there. So and then his granddaughter, I believe, on each one of her pilgrimages to Savannah would always stop by Carver, and we would sit and chat for hours about Mr. Wright and his work, and he was also a bishop. I think his son or something was a bishop of the AME Church, and I'm a very active member of the AME Church. So Richard Wright's history and legend comes through Savannah. It was a part of Savannah, of Carver State Bank, and of course, Mr. Toomer was a friend of Richard R. Wright. And just as he was a friend of and a contemporary of George Washington Carver, and admired him so much until he named his bank Carver. So all of these great legends came through this institution. And when I first got to Savannah, I used to read the old documents, and they were there, easy to access because they were stacked up in Mr. Perry's office. And so I would read little notes that Mr. Toomer had written, and because I never met him, but he had these recliner chairs in his office. They were kind of a burgundy leather chair. And the rumor was that when he would be working in the bank and he'd get tired, he'd just go to sleep right there and spend the whole night just sleeping in his chair. And those chairs stayed in that office until I became the president. And I never will forget how persistent Mrs. Toomer was on getting those chairs when we were remodeling the building. And so I had to have someone deliver those chairs to Mrs. Toomer's house. She wanted those chairs, his widow. But all of these legends, the whole history of John McLaughlin and John B. Clemens, who was our former chairman, and John McLaughlin was the secretary of the board, and he was the person who took me around town when after I was when I first came down for the interview. And Nicole, John McLaughlin was a good friend of Doyle Mitchell's father. And so he took me to that very first NBA convention that was probably held about October before I became president. So I was I attended this NBA convention. I was introduced to people like Doyle Mitchell and Mr. John Wheeler, who was Mechanics and Farmers, and Julia Taylor, who was John Wheeler's daughter, when I was 24 years old. And John McLaughlin would have been the person who took me to my first NBA convention. But all of these legends actually came through Carver State Bank, and Mr. McLaughlin also worked. McLaughlin did a little of everything. I'm sure you know on that from his history, but he actually worked at the Savannah Tribune. You know, and when I finally decided to revive that historic newspaper, I leaned heavily on my conversations with John McLaughlin and his contemporaries.
Well, that was great connection, and that was my sort of easy way to get to the National Banking Association. And before I do that, though, I just want to infuse a little bit more history. And really, you have piqued my memory to know that I too worked at CNS Bank as a teller. But
everybody in Georgia who was in banking worked at CNS Bank at one time. CNS Bank had and I'll stop talking, but CNS had a nameplate, Mr. Lane. If you were somebody in the bank now, a teller, you wouldn't have one of these. But no. Mr. Lane, if you were part of the management program, he gave you these metal nameplates that were just unbelievably nice. They're very, very different from the little plates that people give folk now as gifts. And I've got my metal plate, and I've got the other ones that give you. And so, but if you go around to small banks all over the state of Georgia now, a few years ago, you to any little small banks in South Georgia, there was going to be somebody in that bank who was a former officer of CNS Bank who would have one of those metal nameplates. And so that was our badge of honor. So everybody who had one still has it, and I still have
Well, if you
mine.
decide to give it to a museum, I know one standing behind me there. So and I will tell you, it was a very brief period for me to be a teller at the bank, because it was near the Talmadge Bridge, and I was always afraid someone was going to come by and want to take money with them. So left. All right. Well, what I wanted to, before I introduce, I guess what we need to know, the state of Black banks in America today. I found a business review written in 1952 in the Pittsburgh Courier, my resource on all things Black at that time. And it says that it's a article, business review, Negroes in Banking Part 1. Now, this is 1952. And it says, the Department of Commerce, under the guidance of Emmer M. Lancaster, advisor on Negro affairs, has issued a report listing the assets and liabilities of 14 Negro banks for the period extending from 1939 to 1950. And the list of the 14 banks consists of, at the top, Carver Savings Bank, Savannah, Georgia; Citizens and Southern Bank and Trust, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania; Citizens Savings Bank and Trust Company, Nashville, Tennessee; Consolidated Bank and Trust Company, Richmond, Virginia; Crown Savings Bank, Newport News, Virginia; Danville Savings Bank and Trust Company, Danville, Virginia; Douglas State Bank, Kansas City, Kansas; Farmers State Bank, I think this is Boley, Oklahoma; and Fraternal Bank and Trust Company, Fort Worth, Texas; Industrial Bank, Washington, D.C.; Mechanics and Farmers Bank, Durham, North Carolina; Tri-State Bank of Memphis, Tennessee; Victory Savings Bank, Columbia, South Carolina. It also, just to finish it out, it says, it is significant and encouraging to note that during the past decade, 145 banks either suspended operations or went into receivership proceedings, according to the Controller of Currency. It is with a deep sense of pride, though, that we can state that during that time, no Negro banking institution either suspended operations or had to go through bankruptcy proceedings. This is most unusual when it is considered that the Negro has a narrower market to place sound loans and still more restricted area for which to draw funds to advance. So I thought in 1951, that was phenomenal, to know that these banks existed in that way. And with that brief introduction, I'd like to welcome Ms. Nicole Elam to the platform.
Well, thank you, Vonette. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the Savannah Black Heritage Festival for hosting this important conversation on the state of Black banks, past, present, and future. It's such an honor to be speaking between two generations of bankers, elder statesman Robert James and the chair of the National Bankers Association, Robert James, both of whom I've learned so much about. So thank you. Before I talk about the current state of Black banks from my seat as the president and CEO of the National Bankers Association, which has already been talked about, it's the leading trade association that represents Black and minority owned and operated banks, I want to talk about my journey to the National Bankers Association. Actually started my career 19 years ago in civil rights at the NAACP Washington Bureau, which is the public policy arm of the NAACP. And every year we would put together our policy platform, which is a list of our policy priorities. And economic justice was always a central pillar to our policy platform. It was our list of legislation and regulations that we felt like were essential to close the wealth gap and were essential to advancing racial equity. And so, I always keep that in the back of my mind because I feel like I'm coming full circle here while I'm at the National Bankers Association. From there, I went to the Black Leadership Forum, which was a consortium of all the major civil rights organizations. It was started by the Big Six, which were the leaders of the 6 prominent civil rights organizations. So the NAACP, the National Urban League, SNCC, SCLC, and Labor. And there I did communications and advocacy. Once I graduated from law school, I took a turn. I moved away from civil rights and nonprofit work, and I went to Aiken Gump, which is a major law firm here in DC. And I was a part of the litigation and the public policy team. And it was really interesting because I was there when the market crashed. So it was a time when everybody was being hauled in front of Congress trying to figure out whose fault it was for the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. We were representing mortgage companies, rating agencies, lenders, insurance companies. And it was fascinating because up until that point, I had been at nonprofits and I had been at civil rights organizations, but to see the way that major corporations and industries sought to influence change was, it was just fascinating. In many ways, it was similar to what we did at the grassroots level, but it was on steroids in a number of different ways. The way that they sought to influence policy, right? So you had a team that was preparing and drafting testimony as those corporations went to testify. You had a team that was lobbying, trying to change and shift and influence the way that legislation was coming out. You had a crisis comms team. You had a team that was working on litigation, a team that was working on regulation, a team that was doing grassroots and grass top stuff. And so what I learned is the importance of policy, communications, and litigation all working together to influence change. And so I landed at a couple of different places from Aiken Gump, but eventually I was at JPMorgan Chase. I was in their DC office, and I was there when JPMorgan Chase made their $30 billion commitment to advance racial equity. It was one of the largest commitments that was made at that time. And I was part of the team that was socializing that commitment to policymakers and to national organizations. And a key part of that commitment was utilizing MDIs and CDFIs, those community development financial institutions, those minority depository institutions, to advance racial equity. And it makes sense, right? Because when you think about what the key drivers of wealth creation are, it's one, access to financial services. It's really hard to build and grow wealth if you don't have access to financial services. The second is owning a home. And the third is owning a profitable small business. And so when you think about it, Black banks are at the center of all of that, right? They are sitting in and serving communities of color. So they're providing access to financial services. They are significant providers of mortgages and small business loans. So there are central engines of economic development and wealth creation in these communities. And so from JPMorgan Chase, I landed at where I am now, which is the National Bankers Association. And to date, there are only 19 Black banks, which is, disappointing, right? When you think about the peak, there were over 100 Black banks, and today we only have 19 Black banks. Another thing that is significant when you think about Black banks is their asset size. The average asset size of a Black bank is about $315 million. Now, let me put that into context for you. JP Morgan Chase, $3.3 trillion. The average bank, $4 billion. So these Black banks are the smallest of the small Black banks. They are your community banks that are serving the communities day in and day out. But something has changed, right? Something changed the landscape completely. And it's something that we all know. It's the murder of George Floyd, what Rochelle mentioned at the top of this call. And when the murder of George Floyd happened, you had an unprecedented amount of capital that was flowing to Black banks. People were now starting to talk about Black banks, their roles in the communities, how they can contribute to help close the wealth gap. And you had this capital coming in from all different directions. The government, unprecedented amount of capital, $12 billion flowing into MDIs and CDFIs. You had the public sector flowing in capital. And so it really changed the way that we supported our member banks at the National Bankers Association. I would say before the murder of George Floyd, we were very much your traditional trade association. We focused on policy, really advocating for policies that advanced MDIs and communities that they served, focused on things that raised the profile of our member banks, focused on programming that built the capacity of our member banks. But because of the murder of George Floyd, we had to really shift and begin to focus on partnerships, creating partnerships with the government, with corporate America, with fintechs, with technology companies, with foundations, with investors, focusing on creating these partnerships that capitalized, modernized, and strengthen our banks. Because now everybody is interested in them. And we don't know how long people are going to be interested in Black banks, but we really wanted to leverage this moment to create partnerships. Another thing that we were really focused on is building collaborations, right? These are small banks. And so they can have greater impact if they do things together. They can have scale that they don't have individually. So that's something that we've been focused on. I think our chairman, Robert James, who you'll hear from next, says it best. Last year, it was all about capital, driving capital to Black banks that have historically been undercapitalized. Let's get capital into the banks. And this year, it's really about revenue generation and helping to change the business models of our banks, because they can no longer just be the bank of the Black church or the bank of the small business in their community. We have to begin to expand and modernize. And one way that we can do that is through digitization and modernization. That's a key part of where we're going. So that's the current state of Black banks and where we are today.
Well, that's great. That fits right into, you've got the past that brought you to the present. However, I mean, okay, what you said, I just remember growing up, and well, my mother always said, even if she had money in the other bank, it was always important to put money in the Black bank, and is that lost on our communities now? I mean,
yeah, and I would say, we have to really take it to a 2.0 strategy, right? It's not enough to have money in the Black bank. You want to do your banking business with the Black bank. Who are you getting your loan from? That's what's really important. Don't just, and you saw this with the Bank Black movement, people would come and deposit $100 in the bank. That actually is a liability, right? It costs us money to hold your money. So, we want you to bring your banking business. And that's the same message that we're taking to corporate America, that we're taking to the government. Who are you doing business with? Don't just deposit your money, do your business with us, because loans is where we can generate revenue. We need revenue generation. We need ongoing things that can help us grow and thrive. And so we want, the message to your average person is bring your banking business, your primary banking business to our banks. And we need the whole swath, right? We don't just need the working class, but we need the upper middle, high net worth individuals also to be bringing their money and doing their business. As we digitize and modernize, we know we've got work to do because people bank on their phones, right? So we know that we've got to do our part to help people bank on their phones. But the message is, don't just deposit your money, do your banking business with us.
Well, that's great. And that is bringing us into the future. But before we get to the future, to Robert E. James II, I want to just step back into time to 1961. The bank moved to a brand new location and recently did kind of the same thing, but in the same area, which I think was important, that Carver State Bank has remained in the community where it was founded. That's important as well. So it's a staple. It says just a little bit of this. Organized and chartered in 1927 with a total capital of $3,000. Okay, and this is a story in 1961 where they're recounting the beginning of the bank that couldn't fail. That was the motto of Carver State Bank. That's what Toomer said. Louis B. Toomer's Carver Savings Bank last week moved into a new $50,000 quarters in a sleek, streamlined building at 918 Montgomery Street, where President Toomer held open house. Finally equipped with ultra-modern furnishings, and the new quarters are spacious and well-appointed. Moving into the new building marks the new era for the bank, whose original $3,000 now shows assets of over $1,100,000. So we can call it the bank that couldn't fail for when the other men are all dead now, except Mr. Toomer. The bank is started by Mr. Toomer, has never had any overhead at all, and thus no expenses. Therefore, it couldn't fail for that reason. What about the future?
Is it my turn, Vonette?
Yes, you're the future, man.
Hey,
Listen.
well, I don't know how much I am in the future, but I first want to thank the Savannah Black Heritage Festival for allowing Carver State Bank to, engage with your audience tonight and to have this really important conversation. I want to thank you for the work that you've done over your career in lifting up our entire community and preserving our history and our heritage, and in particular, the history and heritage of Black banks. As you know, and as you've noted, the history of Black banks actually goes through Savannah, Georgia, in many ways. And, I read just a few years ago recently, I did not really personally even know that Richard Wright, who was the founder of the National Bankers Association, actually had roots in Savannah. And so even though the bank that he ran was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, he actually had roots in Savannah, Georgia. And some of the experiences he had as a resident of Savannah were the reason why he moved to Philadelphia and started a bank in particular. And so this is really, really critical history. And so, and the other thing that's really interesting tonight, in my dad recounting his story, I learned some things about his story and how he started at Carver State Bank that I had never heard before. I mean, I literally heard that. So you performed a great service to me, just in hearing more nuance and more detail about, my own family's history and heritage and my dad's legacy. Just very quickly, by way of background, I grew up in Savannah, of course. It's funny, a lot of Savannahans don't consider me local because I wasn't born there. I didn't move to Savannah until I was about 11 months old, so I'm not local. but I was born in Atlanta and moved there with my parents when my dad became president of Carver State Bank. Grew up in that house in Sylvan Terrace that my mom and dad still call home. Graduated from Savannah Country Day in 1988, went on to Howard for undergraduate school and then to Harvard Law School. And I moved back to Atlanta. I practiced corporate law, and then I did a whole bunch of other entrepreneurial things. And what's interesting about my background now and the fact that I'm involved in the bank, I never wanted to be involved in the bank when I was growing up. I never had a summer job at the bank. My mother is the publisher of the Savannah Tribune, so I worked for her. I didn't work for my dad. I never went and worked at the bank. I worked at the newspaper. And when I went to undergraduate school, I wanted to be a lawyer and maybe a politician, but I never thought about banking. And in my career, particularly once I started doing business, being an entrepreneur, it slowly came over me the critical importance of this institution and of Black banks in general. Because once you start getting a sense of how money works in America and the connection between economic rights and all of our other rights. And the fact that America is fundamentally a business enterprise. And so if you want to have full participation in America, being able to fully participate in how capital flows and how capital is formed and how you access capital is really a part and parcel of citizenship. It became more important to me to be involved. And so I joined the board of the bank in, I want to say it was 1999. And the reason I joined the board of the bank was that another legendary Savannian, Curtis V. Cooper, who had been on the board, he passed away suddenly. And there was an open board seat. And so my dad asked me if I could serve on the board. And I was working at a major law firm in Atlanta at the time, and I actually had to ask the partners for permission to join the board of the bank, because typically lawyers in big firms at the time didn't sit on corporate boards. And so I got permission from the partners of the firm, and I started, flying to Savannah once a month just to sit in and participate in the board. And I left that firm in the year 2000. Went into business, and it was really focused on building supplier diversity programs, programs for minority and women-owned businesses in major corporations and local governments, and became a little bit more involved in what the bank was doing. And then, and I could see it from the side of the small business person who has difficulty accessing capital, and some of the barriers that small businesses, particularly minority-owned businesses and Black-owned businesses, have in growing because of their lack of access to capital. In 2004, I became more of a consultant to the bank and started helping the bank work on its community development financial institution issues, and really focusing in on our mission. And just for your audience to understand, a community development financial institution, or a CDFI, is a certification that is provided by the United States Treasury Department that will certify that banks or other financial institutions have a primary mission to serve underserved communities and identify a target market, and they are accountable to that target market, and they make most of their loans in those target markets. And so Carver is one of the few CDFIs, or community development financial institutions, in the state of Georgia. And it has been a certified CDFI since the year 2000, which was another one of the kind of pieces of foresight that my dad had, was he learned about that CDFI program and he got us certified. And then I took over getting us involved in the CDFI programs. And so, it kind of goes from there. In 2007, I was able to help the bank develop its first new branch location in over 30 years, which is the branch on Skidaway and Eisenhower. And then in 2011, we tore down the building that my dad built in the early 70s on Martin Luther King, and we built a new one that houses Carver State Bank's headquarters, as well as what is now the Habitat for Humanity headquarters for Coastal Empire in Georgia. And so we have stayed in that community. We've helped to revitalize that community. We've made major investments in that community, and are still one of the only major Black property owners in that community, which I think is also important. What do we see in the future? Nicole mentioned it. This has been the last 2 years have been unprecedented in the history of Black-owned banks in America, and really for Black America in total. But I think that the funding that has flowed into Black banks and will continue to flow into our banks in the first half of 2022 really presents an opportunity for us to finally start to reduce the racial wealth gap in America. The racial wealth gap, when Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, I gave a speech a couple of weeks ago at the FDIC in Washington, D.C. And for that speech, I was doing some prep, and I realized that when Dr. King was killed in 1968, the racial wealth gap in America was about 10x. In other words, the average white family had about 10 times more wealth than the average Black family. Today, that wealth gap has actually widened.
Of course, yes.
So even though we've made progress, and you have leaders like Bob James and folk like Nicole, Elam who are out there fighting, we've actually lost ground economically. So we can go sit in restaurants and we can eat where we want. We can move into the neighborhoods that we want if we can afford to. We can fly and stay in hotels when we want to. But our wealth, we've actually lost ground. And so you also look at the decline in the number of Black-owned banks over that period of time. And I think that that's directly connected. And so it is really incumbent upon us as the leaders of Black-owned banks to use this new capital. And when we say capital, we're not talking about your deposits. So when you come in and open up an account, we're talking about equity that is invested in the bank. And for every $1 in equity that is invested in a bank, in capital for a bank, we can have $10 worth of lending back into the community. And so when Nicole talks about there being $9 billion worth of capital that's been made available to minority and community development owned, community development focused banks, that can turn into $900 billion worth of investment back in those communities. Black-owned banks in particular are eligible to get just under $1 billion of that money. About $800 million of that is coming into Black-owned banks in particular. And what we need to do is focus on the technology that's going to allow us to lend with safety and soundness, but at greater velocity in our communities. We've got to work together. You heard it from what my dad talked about, what you've talked about, Vonette, in terms of our institutions working together historically. Nicole has talked about it. And that is critical for our future, for us to collaborate. We don't want to see fewer Black-owned banks. We want to see more. Because when we talk about 19 Black-owned banks left in the United States, that's out of almost 5,000 banks. And so that means that we don't own very much. We did some math just recently to figure out how much Black people control of total banking assets in the United States.
Wow.
And it's 27 thousandths of 1% of total banking assets in the United States are controlled by Black people. So it isn't, but the good news is that we've got this capital now. And we're going to start to see, Nicole said that the average Black bank was about 300 million, and that's true. But with the influx of new capital, we're going to see several of our banks eclipse the $1 billion asset mark within the next 24 months, which is fantastic, phenomenal, historical. And that capital can start to be reinvested in our communities. And we can be the ones who, we can be the heroes that we're looking for. We can be the ones that we're looking for in our own communities, but we're going to need we'll need to modernize and give customers what they expect in terms of technology. But then we're going to need the customers. We're going to need Black folks to remember this history and come back to our institutions and bring your primary business to us so that we can work together to build the communities that we're looking for.
I think the future is now. I mean, I hear it in what you're saying. And with that future being now, our communities don't get the two key words that you have alluded to without saying, and that's generational wealth. That is totally missed because we live in the moment. I used to, I was going to Jamaica before COVID a lot, and one of the proverbs there is, dog have money and buy cheese. It's buy something that you don't need, rather than, like you're saying, use that money to invest in a business. My tour company is a small business, and my personal banker who is on this call. I went to him and I said, hey, I need a black business loan. And he said, oh, is that one you pay back? So I said, yes. And I did it in time. You still owe me lunch. So, but, we don't think of that. We'll go to these other banks and they'll say no before you come in the door. All of the things that you've explained that are now becoming available, it's important that you educate. By the way, congratulations to Carver State Bank on their new website. I was really pleased. It's easy to navigate. A lot of times too, because you have elders who bank here locally, they're afraid of that technology. And I think that's going to be something else that as the future is now, that you get into that and say, look, this is here to help you. It's my mother, bless her, she used to want to go to pay every bill at the place it was in. I pay every bill online. I don't want to go those places, so I think that's what the other part of the education that we need to start. If we do it through our churches, if we do it through our community centers, because there are a lot of seniors. I went, for example, one day to a senior citizens place and I had the picture of the museum behind me and they said, that's the Guaranteed Life building. They never think of it as the museum. They think of it as what it was. And that was the other thing. Just one last quick connection here. Black banks were in cooperation with, for example, the insurance companies. Large insurance companies were like, they made as much money as entertainers, North Carolina Mutual, and all of them folded after integration, segregation, they thrived, and so did these banks. So how do you sort of knit all that back together? I guess that's my question now. How do you knit that together now?
That's a great question, Vonette. And I think that's a critical part of this future look. And I think, this is one of the things I think about is what's my role as a part of Generation X. We're the first generation of Black people. I was born in 1970. I'm in the first generation of Black people who did not personally experience legal segregation. And, I think about that quite a bit. And because I think about, what my mom and dad went through in order to provide me and my sisters and what you all provided, what you all did to provide us with these opportunities. And I think that, my generation and Nicole's generation and even younger are now starting to understand better the connection. It's incumbent upon us to continue to drive that connection. And even though our communities may not be connected because we're forced to live together by legal segregation, we can use technology to connect our communities. You mentioned our website. When we relaunched our website, we didn't do any social media or any other announcement of our new website. But we put a feature on the website that allows someone to fill out an application to open up an account online. And we started to see account applications from places like Nicole's hometown of Indianapolis, Indiana, places across the country where there is no Black bank in the community, but a person is going online and finding us, which means that the community is not, it's still a physical thing, but it's also a digital community that we can weave together across the country, and we can touch one another and invest in one another no matter where we are by riding the technology rails that exist. I think that our people are ready. I think that it's up to us as bankers to, again, modernize, tell the story better, make sure that people understand this history and understand how we're going to help them propel themselves into the future. So I'm very grateful to you, to my dad, Bob James, to Nicole tonight, and to the Savannah Black Heritage Festival for giving us this opportunity to have this great conversation.
And I would like to hear from my other panelists here on just a last word of wisdom.
I'll go first, Nicole, and since you have the national platform, you can put us all in perspective. But you said so much when you were talking, and it was a joy for me to hear Robert talk about where we go in the future. And I wanted to tell you that Mrs. Bertha Pickney, your mother, did not just put a dollar or two in the bank. She did do other stuff that she probably didn't tell you about. She was borrowing a little money here and there. So I wanted to publicly to correct that. Bertha was a full supporter, a 100% advocate of Carver State Bank, and in meetings that we would go to, she would certainly let people know that. And then the other thing, when you read that list of banks, and just to put in perspective how long I've been around, you read about 14 names, I believe. I think there were only 3 banks where I did not know the people who were there. I mean, personally know the people. So all of those institutions, going even the Victory Savings to the bank in Dansville, Virginia, that I actually personally knew all of the people and actually visited each one of those offices. Rob is now chairman of the National Bankers Association, and I served 2 terms. The first one when Jimmy Carter was president, but I traveled around just as he does to events at these banks. And so I would have been in Kansas City at Douglas State. I knew the people there who started that bank. And also, and you know, one of the things that was a consistency in the people who started the Black banks, there was this notion of thriftiness. They were founded, they had this idea that Black people needed to save some money and to put some money back for a rainy day and so forth. So if you read any of these original chartering documents or the founding documents of why are we starting this bank, there's this idea that we needed thriftiness. Then there's this idea that we can't get loans from the majority community, so we need our own institution so we can lend ourselves money. And then there's this idea, which reminds me of your mother a little bit, that of secretness. They didn't want during those early years. Black people did not want the white people to know how much money they had. Mm-hmm. And so they kept it out of the white banks. A guy like Mr. Toomer did not want the people over at CNS to know exactly how much he was accumulating. He was accumulating a great deal. So now that kind of got reversed and mixed up later on, but that was one of the major reasons they started their own institutions. And so we have to preserve our institutions. Carver went right straight through that recession that Nicole mentioned, 2008, 2009. We made more money during that than we did the few years before. But and that's because we knew how to manage with less, and we knew how to operate in a crisis. And so we had no major problem during the recession. We went right straight through it. We had liquidity throughout it. So I want to thank you, Vonette, and thank Nicole and Robert for participating in this, and thank and Rachel and the Savannah Black Heritage Festival committee and all of those people who have kept this tradition going in the city of Savannah.
One thing I want to comment on about what you just said. Historically, in terms, we have to go back to enslavement and freedom. After freedom, the freedmen's banks that failed, that was the first failing of a bank that was a Black bank, essentially. And that is where Louis B. Toomer's grandfather stepped in with Reverend Henry McNeil Turner here in Savannah. And they said, we need to open our own bank here in Savannah. And from that, that little colonel, Edward's son, came up with Carver State Bank at Carver Savings Bank. And the quote I was looking for earlier, I found it. His motto, his business motto, I sell the earth and rent the town. So I think if you had that combination as a businessman and a banker, and the realty company, Toomer Realty eventually, and all of those things, we're not entrepreneurs like we used to be. And I think what's been said tonight should encourage anyone who has an opportunity to view this in the future to understand that we should not give up. Tourists that come to town and walk with me, I'll say to them, do you support Black businesses where you live? And they look at me and they're I said, well, don't worry, because there aren't any. And I'm right now at the museum. This is the spoiler alert, doing a West Broad Street room. And the name of the room is Black Business Empire, because we owned West Broad Street. All of the Black businesses that were there, including Carver State Bank, as it is today, as well as the insurance companies. The other words that will be in that room, Black-owned businesses. They were up and down West Broad Street. And we talk about our communities disappearing, but also and people going to affordable housing and all that. But we have to pay attention to business. We need to go back to business. And I think tonight, I'm really glad to hear that the Black banks are not giving up on the Black community and the businesses that can be in them. So Ms. Elam, you have the last word.
A lot of pressure, a lot of pressure. I think my last words would just be a call to action to Bank Black. You know, there's been a lot of conversations around what Bank Black means, but not just depositing your dollars, but really bringing your whole banking business, your primary banking business to Black banks. And that's a call to action for the federal, state, local government. That's a call to action for businesses. That's a call to action to corporate America. That's a call to action to households. That's a call to action to anybody. And if you don't know what that looks like or what that means, go to nationalbankers.org and we will help you find a way to bank Black. Because guess what? You don't need a bank in your backyard to bank Black. You can do it online. So that would be my final word. So thank you again to you, Vonette, the Savannah Black Heritage Festival, and to my panelists for this phenomenal conversation.
Well, thank you. And there will be a whole list. Is there any other comments before we close it out? Okay, great. I thank you all tonight. Thank you, Ms. Rochelle and the Elijah Agency for getting the word out as we talk tonight. I know some of it went by pretty fast, but thank you again. And I like that. I wrote it down, Bank Black. Is that what you said?
Bank Black, not just your deposits, Bank
I
Black.
like it. I like it. Not just the deposit. Okay, all right. And go online to Bank Black. So
there you go. Yeah. No excuse.
No excuse. Please continue to follow the virtual events for the Black Heritage Festival. They are listed somewhere near you. They have the physical copies. I went by Carver today and they have them in the bank, and you can do that too. And I'm sure the Savannah Tribune will be running some stories about all of that, everything that's going on. So thank you all again for your time tonight, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.